Come on, everybody, move in closer. Get together, hug.
All right, we start with the last talk before lunch with Chris Millis. He's already 15 years plus experience in web development. He's currently employed by Mozilla, and he will talk about getting rid of images using CSS3. Enjoy the talk.
Hello, everybody, or as we say in the north of England, hey up. So, yes, I've assembled some interesting collections of ideas, tips, techniques, and general ranting about getting rid of images off the web, if at all possible, because images are terrible things. So a little bit about myself before we go much further, a little bit more about myself. I'm currently a senior tech writer at Mozilla on MDN, doing a whole bunch of documentation about open web apps techniques and Firefox OS apps, so please go and check out my work if you're in need of some interesting things to read. For 6 years before that, I was a web evangelist and a tech writer at Opera Software. So I was the main editor of dev.opera.com, which is also a fantastic site for free resources on modern web technologies. And because Mozilla are such a nice group of people, I'm actually allowed to say that without my kill switch going off. It's fantastic. I'm a general enthusiast into front-end web technologies. Really have enjoyed it. I've mainly worked really as a tech writer and tech publisher rather than a web developer, but I've had my finger in all of these pies and been doing this stuff for a long time, and I absolutely love it. I'm also a bit of an accessibility whinge bag. I think that we should never lose sight of the idea that accessibility is one of the central things of the web, and it's possible to make most of our experiences accessible to people with disabilities. So when we're playing with all of these shiny, interesting new tools, we shouldn't forget that, but people far too often do. I also like to call myself an education agitator. So when I was at Opera, I spent quite a lot of time going to universities and bullying them into improving their web design development related courses, because I think education is such an important thing. And a lot of university and college courses available on front-end technologies really suck. So if you have any contact at all with your local school or university, please try and go and help them out to improve their courses, because it's not really through a malicious wish to destroy the web. It's more usually a lack of understanding or a lack of time or modern knowledge to be able to update these courses successfully. So please go and help out as much as you can. And then outside work, I'm a heavy metal drummer, and I try and enforce really horrible, noisy music on my children wherever possible. And another note quickly, don't worry about making millions of notes on this talk, because my slides are already available at slideshare.net/ChrisDavidMills. So just go there and grab all this stuff. Feel free to reuse it as much as you want. It's all published under Creative Commons. If you have any questions about this stuff after the talk and don't have time to ask me these questions during the end part of the talk, feel free to email me at cmills@mozilla.com or tweet me on ChrisDavidMills. So let's get going. Images, bad? But surely images are a good thing. When Netscape introduced the image tag back really early in the 90s sometime, it instantly made the web a more interesting place, because previous to that, the web was just a really boring set of like science papers and educational documents and all of these kind of things. So it was good. But you do get the problem that they're very bloaty, and lots of images means lots of HTTP requests, and it causes problems, especially when we're thinking about people using mobile devices to view our experiences that we're building, and also when we have to start thinking about responsive web design for high-res devices, it gets even more annoying. Images are also inflexible, and it's often much better to create things programmatically, so that when you need to change something because, for example, your boss decides he wants to check out that drop shadow in 41 shades of blue or whatever the stereotype is, you don't have to keep going back to Photoshop each time and messing about with stuff. So now I will do what I usually do in most of my talks, which is go on a little bit of a history lesson and have a look at what we used to do back in the bad old days before we had all of these modern tools to play with. So let's just look at a few examples of how images used to be annoying on the web. If we wanted to do something like have flexible rounded corners on a box, because of course rounded corners are essential for Web 2.0 compliance, we all know that. We used to have to do ludicrous things like this and have all different nested divs and hang a single image off each div and have ridiculous amounts of CSS like this to position these images in the different places, and it was just really silly. But it was necessary if we wanted to have anything flexible in the way of rounded corner boxes. Historically, we didn't have cross-browser embeddable fonts. This was also really annoying because it meant we had to come up, if we wanted our text to be accessible and not just be a flat image of our company's logo or whatever, we had to do all of these weird image replacement techniques, which all had various problems and none of which were perfect, but some worked better than others. We even started doing things like using Cipher or Kufon, so we'd have a flash movie replacing the actual image on the page, replacing the actual headline on the page and things like that. And that was also, it's a ridiculously complex set of steps to go to just for a comparatively simple feature on a web page. The most recent image replacement technique I saw was this one, which seems quite interesting. I think I saw this on Zeldman's blog a while ago. And it was written by a guy called Scott Kellum, and this is quite interesting because instead of using your text indent of minus 10,000 pixels or whatever, you can use text indent 100%. And that just means that you no longer require your browser to draw a 10,000 pixel wide box, so it's actually a bit better for performance. But anyway, moving on. Drop shadows. This is the other thing that's essential for our beautiful Web 2.0 experiences. These were also really annoying in the past to achieve. If you wanted to do something like this, again, you'd have to have horrible divitis, loads of nested divs everywhere to hang the image itself off and the shadow and the inner box, etc., etc. And you'd have weird stuff like this. Just going to move through these fairly quickly. But this is all equally horrible stuff to have to implement. Gradients, yes, this is another beautiful thing that we all like to plaster everywhere that we can on our web pages. These weren't too bad. These were flexible to a certain degree by just using the thin gradient stripe and repeating it horizontally or repeating it vertically. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that stuff. So that's not too terrible. It just requires some elementary CSS. But what if you want to do a gradient that always flows from the top right to the bottom left of your container, regardless of how wide the container is? That's a lot more difficult with these kind of techniques. Okay, I think you get the point. This is my daughter in her rock and roll princess pose, which I see quite a lot. She's actually the scariest boss I have. And just to make the point that she's not always like this, she also sometimes looks like this. So this is something you'll find. Anybody that already does presentations and doesn't already have children, when you have children, it turns you into the soppiest, most useless person in the world. I have to include pictures of my children in all my talks. So, with that stuff all out the way, let's now move on to look at some of the new toys that we have available for eradicating these troublesome images off our web pages, sites or applications or whatever the hell we want to call them these days. When I'd written this talk, I kind of got around to the way of thinking of, maybe I should have called it Getting Rid of Images with CSS, SVG, and some other cool shit, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Really, the title was kind of ingenuous because there's some more stuff than just CSS here, but, you know, it's generally about new features that make our lives more easy. I also wanted to just add a bit of a caveat into the talk, and this is mainly due to my friend sat there, Rodney Rem, and his 2 days worth of making fun of my talk and saying it should be called something like Frying Your GPU in 3 Easy Steps, which I found quite amusing. So I've added in the caveat, please don't do all of this shit all the time. Test carefully. Be very thoughtful about the fact that, especially when you're on a lower powered mobile device, for example, overuse of this stuff really can cause the whole thing to slow down and turn into a mess. So test carefully and try and avoid the Christmas tree effect. And if you don't, well, Merry fucking Christmas to you. So I first thought that I'd just say a little bit about transparent colors. Again, this is not really a complex thing. I'm talking here about our ability now to use the opacity property to make make different layers slightly translucent or slightly transparent. We're also talking about RGBA and HSLA colors. A lot of this stuff, unfortunately, doesn't work in older browsers, but it does make things a lot easier. And depending on how happy your boss or client is with a very slightly different look in older browsers, you can use transparent colors now to make much more interesting blended effects and such like. If you really want to try and make the stuff work back in older browsers, you could try a polyfill like CSS3 Pi, for example, which does solve just polyfill transparency in some various circumstances. But yeah, again, it's down to testing and whether it's going to affect performance too much on your sites. It can be quite heavy in some circumstances, but it's definitely worth playing with transparent colors. Whereas previously we would have had to have transparent PNGs, which didn't work properly in IE6 anyway, and it was all really horrible. Web fonts is the next one I'd love to talk about. This is one of my favorite CSS3 features. And of course, the idea here is that we can include references to fonts inside our CSS, so we can download these custom fonts that we want. And this is great because it means no more having to worry about image replacement and these other crazy techniques that we used to use. And it's got great cross-browser support. Yeah, I know it's quite rare, but the IE team were way ahead of the rest of us browser vendors on this point. They had embeddable fonts back as far as, I think, IE 5.5. And unfortunately, back then, all of the other browser vendors just ignored IE. They were like, nah, not listening to you, you smell. You know, it's like, it's like that. You know, it's like that kid at school who smells slightly, which was me back in my day. And this is absolutely great. What I would say about it is it's never as simple as you could possibly want it to be. Of course, us browser vendors being the way we are can't agree on a single on a single font format to use, or at least we couldn't for the longest time. There is this thing now called the WAF font format, which browsers are kind of getting round to supporting, but of course this was not supported back on the old versions of IE, which still use this EOT, embedded open type font format. So you need to use a thing called the bulletproof font syntax if you're hosting the stuff yourself, and it looks a bit like this, which is a little bit horrible and a bit slightly hacky, but this pretty much provides the different font formats to the different browsers that need them. Or you could just use a hosted service like Typekit or FontDeck, which is also really good. Some of those are really good, and you tend to get what you pay for. I'd argue that if you've got the money available on the project, you should use a hosted font service. Not only have you got better quality fonts that tend to have less problems with missing glyphs and things in the actual font file, but in addition, they make loads of different variants of the font available. You've got your things like bold and bold italic available, and those fonts also tend to have interesting font features available, such as stylistic swashes and kerning and such like, that in the future we'll actually be able to start grabbing and using those using the font feature settings property, which is supported okay across browsers now, but not great. Another thing that web fonts are great for is putting icons on pages. So going past just needing a heading in an interesting font or whatever, you can actually also use web fonts for icons using a kind of an icon type font. So the way that I do this is as follows. For example, I've got a situation here where I've just got a standard menu, but I want an icon on each one of my navigation items. Instead of having the font character stuck in the actual markup, which could cause a bit of weirdness maybe for screen readers that keep seeing these weird little letters sat everywhere in the markup, it's a good idea to insert it onto your element using HTML5 data attributes. So you can basically put data hyphen and then anything you want, just to store pieces of data on elements that you don't actually want to appear in the page. So I've put my different font letters there using these HTML5 data icon attributes. And then I say this, so I use generated content to say before each one of these A elements, insert the content of the data icon attribute, and then I make it so that any of these things that are appearing before the A elements have the headings, icons, regular font set on it, which means that on the actual page, they will appear like these icons. And of course, this is really good for a number of other reasons, being that they're fonts, they're theoretically infinitely scalable, so don't get all pixely when you zoom in or you see them on high resolution devices. And you can also use any of your regular font properties, such as text shadow or color, to style these icons. So it's a pretty cool thing. Of course, file size can still be problematic with web fonts, especially if you're looking at languages like Chinese or Japanese or Korean. There can be literally thousands of glyphs in these fonts. So, you think, well, if a font is maybe 100 or 200K to download, it's not so bad. But if you're talking kind of 10 meg for a font file, it's really not a very good idea to include on your page, unless maybe if you're doing an intranet or kiosk type situation. So there are ways around this, though. You could use some kind of a font icon service, such as Font Awesome, which is pretty good. That's worth checking out. Or if you think to yourself, well, I literally just want to apply this font to this one H1 on each page, which has got maybe 10 different characters in it, you could either cut up the font file and make a subset of that font using a font editor such as FontForge. There are also paid-for versions, but FontForge is free and open source. It basically just involves going into the font file itself and chopping out the stuff you don't want, so resulting in a smaller file that gets downloaded. Another rather interesting thing available on the horizon, though, is the Unicode range property. And that basically allows you to specify, I'm using this font file, but I only want to actually download this range of characters to use. So that's another way to cut down the amount of stuff that you're downloading. And this is used in this kind of fashion. So obviously, you need to find yourself some kind of Unicode reference, because no one can remember this crazy stuff. But you can basically say, I just want these characters downloaded. There are a few caveats to that. Browser support is okay. I think IE10 supports it. Chrome supports it. Safari supports it. Firefox doesn't support it yet. Oh dear, my kill switch still didn't go off. Isn't that amazing? But that's definitely a thing worth looking into in the future, if not right now. Okay. Next, let's talk about border radius, because it's so cool. As I said, it does kind of make me laugh that this feature was added to CSS purely so we can get rounded corners easier and maintain Web 2.0 compliance without any trouble. Border radius is an interesting one because, of course, it's really simple. It literally is just, I want my border radii to be this many pixels or this many rems or whatever. You can also set separate corner radii for the different corners, and you can even make it so that you can set separate X and Y radii to have elliptical corners. But you can actually do quite a lot of it. Leah Veru, who has been mentioned a few times already this conference for her massive array of awesome tools she's built, has a talk called The Humble Border Radius, which is amazing. It's like 45 minutes just on border radius and how awesome it is. And you wouldn't believe it until you see it, so just go and check out that talk. It's amazing. And the thing that did make me laugh about her talk is she includes this little character called Mr. Border Radius, who's this cute little character built out of rounded corners. But when I talked to her about it, she actually told me it was built using SVG, and I was like, that's so cheating. So I went ahead and built my own. This is my border radius man, built with nothing but border radius and a couple of radial gradients and a transform. It's like, so this does seem, again, a bit disingenuous because one of the things I'm trying to rage against is loads and loads of crazy divitis, whereas this thing is completely pointless and built with about 30 divs with different border radii attached to them, but there you go. It can be done, so why not? So now let's go on to talk about some of the new background-related properties, because this is another interesting area for getting rid of images and clearing up a lot of our markup and CSS cruft. Mainly here going to be talking about gradients, multiple backgrounds, and border image. So gradients is another amazing thing. It's so awesome to be able to have programmatically generated gradients rather than having to make loads of background images in Photoshop and keep changing them all the time. So much more flexible. Linear and radial gradients are supported across all modern browsers, but unfortunately only IE10 plus. There's also a plan to do conical gradients as well, which is quite interesting, but that's just vaporware at the moment. That doesn't exist anywhere yet. And this is pretty simple stuff. I'm sure you've probably all seen this before, but I'll just go through a few things briefly. So we just set the direction the gradient's going in with this to bottom thing. This syntax did change fairly recently. It used to be basically top as in what direction is the linear gradient heading from, but now instead of top we say to bottom, so we're heading to the bottom rather than away from the top. I don't know if that was really worthwhile change, but they did it anyway. So after that, we set a bunch of color stops to basically say, you know, this far along the gradient, I want it to be this color, this far along the gradient, this color, and then the browser just calculates the smooth colors in between. You've also got repeating linear gradients, which is exactly the same, except you just specify like a small section of gradient and it repeats it endlessly. We've also got radial gradients. Now, this stuff has changed fairly recently. The syntax changed quite fiddly and significantly, so just be on the watch out for that. And we've got repeating radial gradients as well. This stuff is definitely worth looking at. The only thing I would say is if you're going to use a gradient as the background of a box, make sure that in the cascade you include a solid background color as well. So just in case the browser can't render that gradient or doesn't know what it is, it still has a stable color to put behind your content, so it's still readable. You can also try polyfilling gradients with CSS3 Pi if you really want to get that stuff working in old IE. And I've got some links to a couple of DevOpera articles about gradients. And of course, if you grab my slides from slideshare.net/ChrisDavidMills, you can discover all of this useful stuff. Another thing that I found interesting is just, again, the creativity that people have put into messing around with properties and seeing how far they can go with them. Again, this is another one of Leah Verou's creations, the CSS3 patterns gallery. And the idea here is that she's basically, her and a bunch of like-minded people have got together and gone, you know, what interesting background patterns can we create just with gradients? So doing things like this and basically saying, I've got these gradients stacked on top of one another with multiple background images, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I'm also using the background size property to change the size of those gradients, so how much size of the background that they fill in. And you can get things like this just using gradients. So CSS3 Patterns Gallery is really quite cool to check out. Next, multiple background images. This is kind of one of those things where you're like, fuck, why wasn't it like this originally in CSS? It's like, why did they go, well, you're never going to want to have more than one image on a background, are you? Nah. I don't know why they did this. There are a few decisions that you look at with W3C stuff over the years, and you think they really must have been smoking something when they did this. Most of it's fantastic, of course. I'm certainly not calling out the W3C. They do some fantastic work. So this is very simple. It literally is just that you can put multiple background images now by separating the different background declarations using commas. Again, you should also put in the cascade a single background declaration on a separate property value, just so that the older browsers, such as old versions of IE that don't understand multiple background images, can still at least render some kind of background. But it's really cool to be able to say, you know, well, I'm going to have this background image sticking to my top left corner, this background image sticking to the top right corner of my box, etc., etc. That's very worthwhile. Something that slightly less people know about is border images. This has actually got much better browser support recently, so it's supported in IE 10+, and some other browsers support it, of course. The problem is that obviously the older versions of IE don't support it, and there's a little bit of strange behavior between some of the different browsers with this, but it's got more stable than it was a year or so ago. The idea is that you basically grab yourself a small image of some kind that you could conceivably think of using to tiling it round the border of a much larger box, and you use this border image property to say, you know, this is the image that I want to slice up into 9 pieces to use as my border. The next thing along there, the number 30, is how big you want the 4 slices to be. If you want the 4 slices to be different sizes, you can have 4 separate numbers there. But here I'm basically saying, you know, there's the top slice, the bottom slice, the left slice, and the right slice. And I want all of those to happen 30 pixels in from the edge of the image. So that then divides the image up into 9 separate pieces. We've also got this fill keyword, and that's quite important because it basically says the slice in the very center of the image that's not going to be used in the border, that will basically be repeated through the whole of the rest of the background that's not the border. And so the fill basically says, do you want that to be invisible or do you want it to be filled in? So that's quite important in various circumstances. Then the other one to talk about here is this round keyword. And the round keyword is fairly important. It basically says, so when I tile my different border images to fill up the whole of the border, I want to actually use enough copies of it so that it fills up the whole entire border, but then I'll slightly round down the size of those images so that a whole number of them fits comfortably inside the border. You can also use repeat, which does the same thing, but it doesn't do that, so you might end up with like an ugly sort of half an image at the end of your block. And you can also, if you want to, use stretch, which says, I'm just going to take a single copy of that border image and stretch it across the whole of your border, but that's really ugly and horrible, and you probably never want to use that. But the upshot is this code will basically take this image I'm showing here and give you something more like this. One of the biggest issues at the moment is not all of the browsers support the round version of the image fill-in property, so you can only use repeat and stretch on a few of the browsers. I think Chrome still doesn't support it. I'm not sure actually, but there are definitely one or two browsers that don't, so that's worth keeping in mind. It's definitely worth playing with though. Let's now get to shadows. We all love drop shadows, don't we? This is the other essential Web 2.0 compliance thing I was talking about earlier. And again, having flexible programmatic shadows is another brilliant thing for getting rid of all of these hours spent messing about in Photoshop and not in the pub, which is where we should be. Box shadows are supported on IE 9+, and then you've also got text shadow, which you can apply just to text rather than a box. That's weirdly only supported in IE 10+. It just seemed to sort of get forgotten out of the IE 9 support. It's possible to do multiple shadows. So for example, here we've got several shadow declarations, but just with commas separating them. Now, the different values here, the first two are the X and the Y offset from the box. It basically just says, you know, a positive value says, I want my shadow to be moved right and down from the original position of the box or the text. Negative values will move it left and up. And then the end value is just the base color of the shadow. And out of all of the different effects you might want to do with text shadows, by far the most popular one I found that all people want on their site is the flaming text shadow. Everybody wants this on their website, particularly if they're in a heavy metal band, you know. So maybe my cross-section of my survey was slightly biased, I don't know. And what's even cooler is you can take a leaf out of Rachel's book, for those of you that saw Rachel's talk before, and then animate the flames so that they actually flicker. Oh, it's so cool. Moving on to box shadows, there's a couple of extra options that you can do with box shadow. There's also an inset keyword that you can put at the start of each shadow declaration that you can see at the bottom there. The inset keyword basically means I want this to be an inner shadow rather than an outer shadow, so that's quite useful. And then you can also include a fourth pixel value before the color if you want to, which is a spread value. So that basically says I want to make my shadow slightly bigger than the original box. It's kind of like padding for shadows. I've never really found a use for it, but it is available if you want it. And the code I'm using here goes to create these rather nice button effects. So effectively I've got an inner shadow at the top of the box, an inner shadow at the bottom of the box, and then a couple of outer box shadows to create this rather interesting effect. The other thing that's very nice is if you want a kind of a button press in effect, you can have an inner shadow, an inset shadow attached to a hover state or an active state. So that's another quite fun technique for those of you who want to play around with interesting graphics. So after being thoroughly blasted with CSS, let's look at some SVG. So something I find quite interesting when I have conversations with people about web technologies all around the world is not many people really know that much about SVG. I think people are starting to grow to it a bit more, but there's a lot less people who actively use and know about SVG than CSS, because I mean, it's a different technology. Historically, I think SVG was never warmed to because IE was and still is the dominant browser, and IE historically refused to support SVG. But it is really, really awesome in so many ways. The idea is that we're creating vector graphics using markup. So this is theoretically infinitely scalable, so good for responsive web design issues, although, again, if you've got a lot of really complex SVG, it could have quite a significant processing hit for your device, so you need to test and think about that carefully still. You can do there's a number of ways to use SVG in a page. So most browsers allow you to use SVG as a background image. You can also embed SVG using object elements and things like that. But you can also just put SVG directly into your HTML page if you want. And that's by far the most useful way of doing it, because when it's actually inside the page's DOM, you can then start manipulating the SVG using CSS and JavaScript. On the support side of things, IE less than 9 doesn't support really any SVG, but you can polyfill that using something like SVG Web or Raphael.js. Modern browsers do have good support. You can actually do some really complex things with SVG, like filters and masks, but I'm not really talking about that stuff here. I'm literally just talking about the very basic graphical possibilities, such as circles and paths and filling in those paths and things like that. You really don't need to be an expert and know about all the complex stuff to get a lot out of SVG. You don't even need to hand code SVG. Although, I mean, I know a few people that hand code SVG and they're just insanely smart, but you can use programs like Illustrator or Inkscape, which is a free alternative, to create SVG images. And then you can just go and grab the code out of the SVG files, insert it into your HTML, and do useful things with it. So just a very quick basic example here. This is kind of what SVG looks, your average SVG export from Illustrator will look like. So I've put it inside a div on my page just to keep it all contained, but then you've got your SVG outer element. And then the most useful thing to understand here is these path elements. So a path element just includes a whole bunch of coordinates that explain the path the SVG element is going to draw. And being that it's just elements on a page, you can grab these using CSS or JavaScript and do interesting things. There are also some SVG-specific CSS properties. So I'm using the fill property here to set what the fill color of these different paths is going to be. And then I've also mucked about and done some even and odd env of type on the different paths inside the SVG to set the different tentacles of the tribal sun different colors. And then I've also added a transition. So you can get this kind of stuff. Most modern browsers now allow you to animate and transition SVG-specific properties as well. And of course, this kind of thing is really tiny and will just take up a fraction of the amount of space that an actual proper image, that a raster image would be. It's also scalable, and it's also less HTTP requests because you can have this embedded in your page. I also thought I'd talk about Canvas for a little while, because I've been doing a lot of messing about with Canvas recently and found some interesting things. So yeah, Canvas is an image, so it's not really getting rid of images, it's more like adding images, but hey, never mind. I'm quite glad to take the hypocrisy vote if you really want to hit me on the head with it. But again, it allows you to do some interesting things. You can draw and animate stuff. You can basically use JavaScript, a JavaScript API to draw things on the canvas you put in the page. You can even polyfill it in older versions of IE that don't support it using something like Xcanvas. And I found there's some very useful applications to it. You can basically do things like this. So messing about with primitives and drawing these weird sunflower kind of effects is one thing I was doing. You can also do stuff like this, which kind of looks a little bit like what Rachel was doing in her last talk, but instead of using CSS, here I'm using JavaScript. I'm basically using a set interval animation, and every single time the set interval is run, I'm just incrementing a variable which moves the position of the draw image around. So each time I'm showing a different frame of the animation. So it's very similar but different. Now, the problem is, though, in terms of the kind of stuff we're talking about here, Canvas isn't really the best for this kind of stuff. Even though I've had fun playing with it, my conclusion would be that I'd say it's a lot easier to do this kind of stuff with CSS. And then, of course, because you're actually doing it rendering using CSS by the actual browser rather than taking an intermediate step up to JavaScript, it's probably more performant. And then also Canvas has other problems of its own, such as it has a text API, but any text you put in there is inaccessible because it's just drawn onto an image, so that's a terrible idea. Canvas is very useful for other things, though. If you want to do things like the same games that you used to do in Flash 15 years ago, awesome, you can use Canvas for that. Haven't we taken a lot of steps forward? But it's cool for things like games. It's also cool for data visualization, where you need to keep changing an interesting visualization of data. I've seen some really awesome stuff, like big world 3D rendered world maps showing flight routes that update in real time and things like that. Canvas is great for that stuff. But then it's also rather useful for things like on-the-fly image processing. So it's got a draw image function and a toData URL function. And that basically allows you to draw an image onto the canvas. Then you can manipulate the image, and then you can use toData URL to take it off the canvas again and put it back onto the page as an image. So you could do things like, so for example, here is a color histogram. So it uses Canvas to take a histogram of the color on an image and draw it on a chart. And then another useful one I saw was this masking technique that Chris Heilman made. So he basically goes, okay, I'll grab this image that I want to add a mask to, I'll draw it on a canvas, I'll use like an image, Canvas has kind of image compositing type functions as well. So I'm going to composite that image using this mask outline,